My hands were shaking when I pulled the blazer from the closet that morning. Not from nerves, not from cold. Vancouver in October rarely gets cold enough to justify trembling, but because I knew exactly who would be standing in that backyard in 4 hours, holding a glass of Pinot Grigio and smiling at me like none of it had ever happened. My mother's 60th birthday party. 3 years in the making, according to her. 3 years of planning the guest list, the canapés, the string lights she'd ordered from a boutique in Gastown. 3 years during which she had also, without a single apology, dismantled the life I thought I was building and handed the pieces to my younger sister. I zipped the blazer. I checked my reflection once. Then I drove to her house anyway. I should explain who I was before all of this, because the woman I am now barely recognizes her. I was 30 years old, working as a senior accountant at a mid-size firm in downtown Vancouver. I had a rent-controlled apartment in Mount Pleasant that I loved more than was probably healthy. I had a Saturday farmer's market habit, a yoga mat I actually used, and a boyfriend of 3 years named Daniel who I was almost certain I would marry. Almost. That word would come to haunt me. Daniel was the kind of man who remembered to ask about your day and actually listened to the answer. He was a project manager at a construction firm, stable and thoughtful. The sort of person who kept a spare umbrella in his car because Vancouver, obviously. We had talked about buying a place together. We had toured condos in East Van. We had argued, gently, about whether 2 bedrooms was excessive and then laughed about it over takeout pho on Main Street. We were, by every measure I could see, fine. We were building something. My sister, I'll call her my sister because that's what she is, legally, biologically, irreversibly, was 26 and had what people in my family called a gift for living. She was luminous in rooms. She laughed loudly, dressed beautifully, and somehow made even airport lounges feel like she was the host and everyone else was a guest. People orbited her. My mother orbited her. My mother had been orbiting her since the day she was born, and I had spent 30 years adjusting my own gravitational pull accordingly. I was never bitter about it, not exactly. I understood that my sister and my mother had a particular frequency between them that I simply didn't share. My mother wanted excitement, color, the feeling that life was something that happened to you rather than something you steadily constructed. I was a constructor by nature. I built budgets and 5-year plans and grocery lists in my phone that I actually followed. My mother found this admirable in theory and dull in practice. She told me once, over coffee at the kitchen table when I was maybe 25, that she worried I was playing it too safe. I stirred my coffee and nodded and did not point out that she had gone through 2 marriages and 3 significant financial crises by that age, and that perhaps safe was not the worst thing to be. What I didn't know, for 3 years, was that my mother had made a decision about my future without consulting me. She had looked at my life, the apartment, the accounting firm, the thoughtful boyfriend with the spare umbrella and decided it wasn't enough. Not for her vision of what a daughter should be. And she had done something about it. I found out on a Tuesday in November, 2 years and 8 months into my relationship with Daniel, 11 months before he was supposed to propose. I know the proposal was planned because I found that out too, later, in the wreckage of everything. I had gone to my mother's house to drop off a slow cooker I'd borrowed. She wasn't home. I let myself in with my key, left the slow cooker on the counter, and was heading back through the kitchen when I noticed her laptop open on the island. I wouldn't have looked. I genuinely wouldn't have. But my name was in the subject line of the email sitting open on the screen, and the human brain is not designed to walk past its own name without reading. The email was from Daniel. To my mother. Dated 3 months earlier. It was a reply. I scrolled up. My mother had written to him first. A long email, almost 2 pages, which I read standing in her kitchen with the slow cooker still warm in my arms. She explained, with careful and almost clinical language, that she had concerns about the direction of his relationship with me, that she believed he deserved a partner who matched his energy, his ambition, his social nature, that she had someone in mind, that she was prepared to help him make a transition that might otherwise feel financially difficult. She referenced a specific figure, $80,000 Canadian, to be transferred in 2 installments if he ended things with me and, in her words, gave things a chance with my sister, who had recently told my mother she had feelings for him. Daniel's reply was 2 paragraphs. He thanked her. He said he had struggled with some of the same thoughts himself. He said he would handle it carefully. He said he appreciated her trust in him. 3 weeks after that email, he had ended things with me. Sitting in my apartment on the couch I'd bought at a vintage store on Fraser Street, he told me he felt like we were moving in different directions. That he cared about me but wasn't sure we wanted the same things. That he was sorry, genuinely sorry, and that he hoped I knew this wasn't about anything I'd done. I had believed him. I had cried for 2 weeks. I had called my mother and she had come over with wine and takeout Thai and told me that sometimes these things just don't work out and that I was young and that I would find someone who truly saw me. She had held my hand and said it while having orchestrated every single word. I stood in her kitchen for a very long time. Then I set the slow cooker on the counter, closed the laptop exactly as I'd found it, locked the door behind me, and drove home. I did not call her. I did not confront her. I did not send a screaming email or show up at her door. Part of this was shock, pure and simple, the kind that makes your body go quiet in ways you don't choose. But part of it, the part that surprised me when I finally examined it, was something closer to clarity. A cold, clean certainty that I was not going to give her the satisfaction of a scene. She had spent my entire life making me feel like I was too practical, too measured, too controlled. I decided that for once she was right. I was going to be exactly that. I made a plan. I gave my notice at the firm in January. I had a strong enough reputation in the industry that I had 2 offers within 3 weeks. One was from a firm in Calgary. I took it, senior manager, a 15% salary increase, and 4,000 kilometers from my mother's kitchen. I told no one except my direct manager that I was leaving. I packed my apartment over 3 weekends in February, sold or donated what I couldn't fit in the moving truck, and handed back my keys on a Thursday afternoon. I texted my mother that I was relocating for work, that I was fine, that I'd be in touch. She called 4 times. I let them go to voicemail. Her messages were a mix of confused and wounded, which I found, I will admit, satisfying in a way that took some of the guilt away. I arrived in Calgary in early March. The city was colder than I expected and drier and flatter, and for approximately 6 weeks I was convinced I had made a terrible mistake. Then spring came, and I found a running route along the river pathway, and a farmer's market in Inglewood that reminded me enough of Vancouver to feel like home without feeling like grief, and a woman at my new firm named Priya who became my first real friend in the city. I worked. That sounds reductive, but it was the truest version of what I did. I worked with a focus that felt, honestly, like grief redirected. I took on files that were considered difficult. I stayed late when it was necessary and left on time when it wasn't. I asked for a mentor. I got one. I asked for stretch assignments. I got those too. Within 18 months I had built a reputation at the firm that I was quietly proud of in a way that my old self wouldn't have known how to be. I also, slowly, began to understand that I had spent 30 years making myself smaller in my own family. Not smaller in the dramatic, obvious way of people who are visibly mistreated. Smaller in the quiet, habitual way of a person who has decided that her presence is tolerated rather than wanted, and has learned to take up only the space that seems acceptable. I had been doing it so long I couldn't see it from inside. Therapy helped with that. I'd always considered therapy something other people needed, which is the kind of thought that is itself a sign you need therapy. My therapist in Calgary was a dry-humored woman who had an office near the university and a habit of letting silences run long enough that you felt compelled to fill them with things you hadn't planned to say. I found her useful in the same way I found a well-organized spreadsheet useful. She showed me the actual numbers instead of the story I'd been telling myself about them. Through all of this, I didn't tell my brother what our mother had done. I want to be honest about that choice because I've thought about it since. He was in his own relationship, navigating his own life. And I didn't want to hand him something he'd have to carry. Maybe that was protective. Maybe it was controlling. My therapist had thoughts. We discussed them over several sessions. About 2 years after I moved to Calgary, I met someone. His name was Marcus. He was an architect who designed commercial buildings and spent his weekends cooking elaborate meals from cookbooks he took out of the library because he believed buying them was unnecessary unless you'd made at least 30% of the recipes first, which I found both eccentric and completely logical. He had a dog named after a Canadian Prime Minister, which I am choosing not to specify to protect the dog's dignity. He was patient in a way that had clearly been built rather than inherited. He had been through something difficult some years before a divorce, handled quietly and without drama, and it had left him, not bitter, but careful. The same way I had become careful. We were careful together for a while. Then we weren't anymore. I was 33 when my mother called to tell me she was turning 60 and that she was having a party and that she expected me there. She did not phrase it as an invitation. She said expected, which was at least honest. I had maintained a functional relationship with her during the 2.5 years since I'd left. Functional is the exact right word. Birthday calls. Christmas visits that I kept to 36 hours maximum. Polite questions about her life and surface-level answers about mine. She knew I lived in Calgary and that I had a job I liked. She did not know about Marcus. She did not know what I had read on her laptop or what I understood about the architecture of what she'd done. I had never given her the scene she would have expected. I had simply built a different life at a safe distance and refused to let her narrate it. My sister had, by then, been with Daniel for over 2 years. They were living together in Burnaby. My mother mentioned them the way she mentioned the weather casually, with the assumption that I had processed this and moved on. I told Marcus about all of it in the car on the way to Calgary International. Not all at once. He'd heard pieces over the previous year, but the full shape of it, the email, the money, the careful quiet exit, the way I had driven away from my mother's house that day in November and just kept going. He listened. When I finished, he reached over and put his hand on mine on the center console and said, "I think you've been incredibly patient." I thought about that the whole flight. The party was in the backyard of the house I'd grown up in. White string lights, exactly as my mother had planned. A catering company from Kit's doing a Mediterranean spread. About 40 people arranged in clusters across the lawn, most of them my mother's friends from her book club and pottery class and the various social infrastructures she maintained with the same energy she'd never quite applied to parenting. Marcus was beside me. My brother saw us first. He came across the yard with genuine warmth. He and I had stayed close, our relationship largely separate from everything with my mother, and shook Marcus's hand and gave me a long hug and told me I looked well, which I did. Objectively. I had arrived feeling like myself in a way I hadn't in this particular backyard before. My mother found us about 20 minutes in. She had made her way through the party the way she always did, touching shoulders and air-kissing cheeks, in her element in a room she'd arranged. When she turned and saw me standing with Marcus, she stopped. Not dramatically, my mother was too practiced for that, but I saw the recalibration happen. She had expected me to arrive alone. She had, I think, expected me to arrive looking like someone who had been managing a quiet sadness at a distance. Instead, I was standing in her backyard in a blazer I felt good in, beside a man who was holding my hand without being asked to. She kissed my cheek. She said I looked wonderful in a tone that indicated this was unexpected. She turned to Marcus and asked how we'd met with the specific politeness she used when she needed a moment to adjust. Across the yard, I saw my sister. She was with Daniel. They were talking to someone I didn't recognize. My sister laughing the way she always laughed, filling the space around her. Daniel had his hand on the small of her back. He looked from 20 meters away, like a man who had made a choice and was living with it. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. He held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then looked away. My sister took a few beats longer. When she finally registered what she was looking at me, Marcus, the fact that I was standing in this yard looking like someone who had not spent 3 years quietly falling apart, something moved across her face that I'd never seen on her before. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was something more complicated. The particular discomfort of a person who had told themselves a story about someone else and is suddenly confronted with evidence that the story was wrong. I did not go to them. I did not avoid them either. I moved through the party the way I'd learned to move through rooms in the past 3 years, on my own terms, at my own pace. I talked to my mother's friends. I ate the canapés, which were excellent. I introduced Marcus to my brother's wife, who I adored, and watched them fall into an easy conversation about renovation permits that somehow became genuinely animated. At some point in the evening, my sister came to find me. She looked, in person, the way she had always looked, effortlessly lovely, wearing something I couldn't have identified as expensive but was. She hugged me. I let her. She said she was glad I came, that she'd missed me, that she thought about me a lot. I said, "I'm sure you do." She paused. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether to push on a door or leave it closed. I watched her decide. Then she said, "He does love me, you know." I considered this for a moment. The string lights were warm above us. Somewhere behind me, Marcus was laughing at something my brother had said. The party moved around us with the particular low-level noise of people who are comfortable and fed and slightly into their second glasses of wine. I said, I hope so. For $80,000, I'd want it to be love too. The color left her face the way color leaves a room when someone turns off a lamp. I did not say anything else. I didn't need to. I had said the one thing and I left it there, not for cruelty, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in it, but because I had decided, a long time ago in a car driving away from Vancouver with a moving truck ahead of me, that I was not going to carry their knowledge for them anymore. They had always known, on some level, what had been done. Naming it, once, quietly, was not revenge. It was just me putting something down. I found Marcus near the dessert table. He was holding a butter tart that the caterer had placed at the end of the spread, and he had the expression of a person who has just discovered something unexpectedly good. He said, "These are remarkable." I don't know why I was resistant, and I laughed, actually laughed, in my mother's backyard, in front of everyone who had expected me to arrive diminished and leave relieved. My mother spent the rest of the evening careful not to be alone with me. I noticed. She laughed and hosted and touched shoulders and refilled glasses, and every time she was in my orbit she found a reason to redirect. Once, briefly, across the yard, we made eye contact. She held it for a moment. I saw something in her expression I might have called regret, though my therapist would tell me I can't know what another person feels and shouldn't project. What I can say is that she looked at me like a woman who had made a calculation years ago and was only now running the correct numbers. I drove back to the airport the next morning. Marcus slept most of the flight, which he could do with an ease I envied. I watched the Rockies pass below us and thought about everything I'd left in Vancouver and how little of it, it turned out, had actually been mine. What I kept, the Mount Pleasant apartment's particular quality of light, which I'd tried to replicate in Calgary and almost got right. The farmer's market habit, the yoga mat, the understanding that I was a person who built things steadily and carefully and that this was not a flaw to be corrected. What I let go, the belief that being loved by people who were wrong for you was better than being alone. The idea that my family's version of me was the accurate one. The weight of 3 years of someone else's decision that I had been carrying without having made it. My mother called me 2 days after the party. I picked up. She said the party had gone beautifully, that she was glad I'd made it. That Marcus seemed wonderful. She said she'd like to visit Calgary sometime. I said I'd like that too, and I meant it, in the way you can mean something and also know exactly what it will and won't include. She didn't mention my sister. She didn't mention Daniel. She didn't mention the email, which still exists on a server somewhere and which I have never brought up and may never bring up. Some things don't need to be litigated. Some things just need to be known. I know. She knows I know. That is enough. Marcus and I bought a house in Inglewood 8 months after the party. A semi-detached with a small backyard and a kitchen that needed updating and south-facing windows that filled the main floor with afternoon light. We had the kitchen renovated in February and argued, gently, about cabinet hardware for 3 weeks, which is the domestic equivalent of the condo conversation Daniel and I once had. This time I didn't say almost. This time, standing in a half-renovated kitchen with paint swatches taped to the wall and a dog tracking dust across the floor, I knew. There's a thing my therapist said once that I've thought about often since. She said that the stories families tell about us are the first drafts. That we don't have to keep living in the first draft. That revision is not betrayal, it is just the work of becoming more accurate. I was never the daughter my mother wanted me to be. I was never the person my sister thought she needed to outshine, or that Daniel needed to leave behind for a better option, or that my father, absent since my teens, a whole other story, thought would turn out fine regardless. I was never any of those things. I was just a woman who built things carefully, and kept building, and eventually built something that didn't need anyone's approval to stand. The string lights at my mother's party were beautiful. I'll give her that. She has always known how to dress a room. But I drove away from that backyard in a rental car with Marcus beside me and the Rockies waiting at the other end of the flight, and the lights faded in the rearview mirror, and I did not feel like I was leaving anything behind. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, like I was going home.